But our guest here today, Ben Smith, has been extremely focused recently. He has moved from being editor-in-chief of BuzzFeed, where he didn't create controversy. The controversy was there. He pointed out there was a controversy with the Steele report on Trump's Russian connections, or alleged Russian connections. Let's be careful with the libel lawyers. And is now a columnist at the New York Times who specializes in media and produces many thoughtful columns on media, which at these times we have COVID-19, which has brought paywalls up, brought paywalls down. We have an election where we have a somewhat eccentric presidential form of discourse, which is variously reported as either tablets from the top of Mount Sinai brought courtesy of Moses and Trump, or as complete ravings of a distranged lunatic, depending on which end of the spectrum you're looking at. Ben, we've also, by the way, got possibly World War III brewing in Southeast Asia and in the Middle East. And on top of all of that, we have an eco crisis beyond precedent. So there's lots of stuff for the media to work from. Do you think the media is doing a good job on all of this material?
That's I'm not sure. I think we can, look back next year and see how we did. It's such a feels like such sort of an intense moment of crisis. I do think that the next couple of months are going to be really kind of interesting and hard. Trump would obviously, in this country, like to have the media sort of on the ballot. Like the Republican platform, in fact, is sort of like, is only 6 bullet points, and one of them is an attack on the media. And I think he would as much like to run against sort of CNN, New York Times, NBC as Joe Biden. And so I think there's this temptation for journalists to sort of take him up on that. That sometimes is, I hope people will resist.
But one of the media is, as you said, at the core of this election in lots of ways. I mean, one of the things is, for the first time, the media is, to some extent, some of the media has stood up. They've said, if you have press conferences devoid of content, we're not going to be there to be props in your circus. And they said, we're not going to the White House COVID briefings, for example, which, bearing in mind how sickeningly deferential the American mainstream press often is towards presidents of all colors, it took a lot, not so much of courage, but must have taken a lot of exasperation of them to say, no, we're not going to go to the White House.
Yeah, that's right. And although they're back in the White House, I mean, and the business of standing up and confronting him about truth remains a sort of, being a White House reporter for many years was sort of like this very boring hostage situation. Like it was kind of a career killer. And I think now is, you can really you can sort of enact this theatrical morality play, and it's hard to resist and good for your career.
But one of the things about the media is we're not very good at being critical about the media. We tend to be deferential about ourselves as well. I have worked with reporters who have very clearly got a line. It's written out for them before they leave the office, the report that they're going to come back with. I've sat with a cabal during the election, and they've sat together and said, well, what's today's line then? And they work out what the line is going to be. And it's partly through political intimidation, and partly because it's much easier. None of them want to scoop each other. They all want to make sure they're singing from the same hymn sheet, so there's no questions asked that might affect their career afterwards. So, it's with BuzzFeed, you did get into a more critical area. You broke some of the rules, like you published Steele's dossier when others were saying you should have waited until you checked out every dot, jot, and tittle on it and made sure it was true. So, do you think has the change gone far enough, or do you think we should do more of that type of reporting?
I think that, maybe the question of whether we should is sort of immaterial. Like, I thought it was the right thing to do. But I also think that we're in this increasingly kind of diverse media landscape, again, like it or not, where these people are, nobody can sit down and decide the line because we're not allowed in the same room, but also, where the big institutions that used to dictate coverage have diminishing power, right? And so if if you don't publish it, BuzzFeed might, if the New York Times doesn't. Maybe it's not the New York Times' role to do that, but I guess my own view is that if there's something that's, that all the journalists know about and that they think is important and influential, and that politicians and, the President of the United States has been made aware of, that your audience probably has a right to see that too, and it's kind of your job to share it with them. But I think that's not it's kind of an internet-y view. I think it's not universally held, but I think increasingly it's sort of clear that you're not going to have a kind of universal standard for all the different, very, very diverse players in this landscape.
But one of the points you made there is about the internet, is that if you assume you publish it on BuzzFeed, the rest of the world knows, but most of the rest of the world is going to be going to CNN, MSNBC, or Fox, heaven help us, rather than BuzzFeed. And very often it's what they say that will dominate the popular consciousness, not what the internet says.
I don't know. I think nobody has the share of the voice that they used to, and really at any given moment anybody can. I mean, I think it's much more dynamic. I mean, in BuzzFeed, BuzzFeed and outlets like that have enormous scale and reach lots of people. But yeah, and then I think the meanings of things are more likely to be hashed out in some ways on social media than they are kind of determined by, a big columnist at a newspaper 3 days later. And if you watch cable news, basically what you see are people reading tweets aloud.
Yes, it's very distressing. But how do we cope with a media environment where nobody actually seems to be doing any reporting as it is? They're all sitting watching each other's tweets. It becomes a sort of incestuous echo chamber, which is a phrase which is often used.
Yeah, I mean, I think honestly, it's a huge comparative advantage to report. I mean, I'm certainly finding that on this beat, but I think there's lots and lots of news to break. There is a lot of the industry that is devoted to recycling tweets, and at BuzzFeed certainly we were very focused on breaking news because there's a huge premium on it. And that's, I actually think that it's undervalued in some ways, just because as you say, there's a lot of churn.
I mean, this preparation for this, I was looking over some notes I did, and many years ago, I interviewed Don Black, who was with Dow Jones, and this was over 20 years ago. He said one of the big problems that I see is that there's more demand for content now than ever before, but nobody's worked out a way it's going to be paid for, or how the journalists involved will be recompensed for it. So we're talking about the internet. We're talking about a lot of people working at less than minimum wage to produce this product, and people who consequently mightn't have the chance to do fact checking, don't have the chance to go doorstepping, don't have the chance to do the type of research that a more traditional reporter would have done. And their intentions may be good and their instincts may be good, but they just don't have the resources, do they?
Yeah, I think that's largely true. That on the online kind of advertising business just never quite evolved to support investigative reporting. I think in a couple of cases, BuzzFeed, Vox, they build business models that can do some of it, but not on the scale of the Times. And meanwhile, local news, the people who used to do a lot of it are have sort of been chipped away at. I think it's interesting. I think that the big new trend is it's becoming a direct-to-consumer business. It's becoming a business where people pay directly for news to an individual journalist, to an organization. And, I think a lot of really interesting people and ambitious journalists are starting newsletters, sending them to subscribers. Again, it's a little hard to see that then how that scales to 4 reporters spending 6 months on a project or something like that. The incredible luxuries of these big institutions. And it does, again, favor stuff you can turn quickly and sitting at your desk. But I also think you see a certain amount of good investigative journalism coming from new places. There's a guy named Judd Legum who's been breaking a lot of news in his newsletter. So I don't know. I think it's a mixed picture.
It's a mixed picture. I'm trying to see if there's a direction in the mixture, though. It's with the eddies.
Oh, down. I mean, we're in a terrible economy. The direction is down. There are green shoots and leaves, but I think they're kind of overwhelmed by like the macro picture of advertising taking this huge hit. Most journalists in America, I would think numerically, still work for places that, or who are writing words, still work for places that print. And I think there are these two things happening that sometimes get confused, which is online outlets like BuzzFeed and Vox and others are struggling with the difficult economics of the internet. And then print newspapers with huge pension liabilities and giant printing presses and physical papers that are diminishingly read are dealing with this kind of much deeper crisis, because it's not, they have this huge overhead and huge costs that just don't match up at all with the economics of the place they're trying to get to. And, you have a couple of bankrupt companies, and it's just really unclear how they dig their way out of that.
And you mentioned about the people paying for it. There's a sort of Greshams law involved, isn't there? When people are giving out the stuff free, then it devalues the stuff that people are trying to charge for.
Yeah, but I think that's really changing. I mean, I think you can. I find it. I have lots of subscriptions, but also when you click from Twitter, half the time you're not logged in, and I don't know. I find myself hitting paywalls more and more. Right? I mean, the Atlantic, the New York Times, the Washington Post. The FT, the Journal, they've all both put up and tightened paywalls. I think you're just increasingly, I think that in some ways the real risk is that you have a kind of two-tier system where the 1% of people, or 2%, or 3% would be amazing, who are going to pay for news. Maybe say like 10% would make these incredible businesses get really high quality news, and the open internet only, serves second quality stuff. And I think that's a problem that the platforms have to think about and reckon with. And when Facebook has started paying for news, I think one of the things they're thinking about is, like, in a way, we're a cable company. We want to make sure that our customers get good stuff, and we're going to pay for it, so it's on the platform. So I do think that the models are shifting a bit, and it's in the commercial interests of some of these tech companies to make sure that there continues to be quality free journalism on the open internet, because just because they need it for their audience. I think it's
It's almost Orwellian though, isn't it? With a sort of inner party, outer party look to it.
Yeah.
And I was in China many, many years ago, and I got access to the inner party bulletins that they pass around amongst the senior leadership. And it was an Alice in Wonderland world anyway. I mean, it was, it operated on peculiar definitions, but it was much more informative than what people were getting in the People's Daily or the People's Liberation Army Weekly. It was,
right. And I think that is sort of the worry. You get the real stuff if you subscribe, and kind of the highly partisan summary, barely recognizable on social media if you don't pay.
Is there any way out of it that you can see? I mean, people have explored models on how to finance news, how to finance investigations. And, on occasion for a cause you can, but motivating people with, truth journalism and the comics as a sort of slogan is a bit more difficult. Getting Batman might be an easier one. Yeah,
I don't think there's any one way out. I mean, I think, you have these big trends against print in particular, which aren't going away. And which are accelerating with the pandemic, against print and against advertising, which are, still huge shares of what's happened, of the revenue for the industry. But I mean, I guess my sort of more optimistic point of view is that the biggest players in the ecosystem, which are Google and Facebook, are increasingly realizing that, both for kind of commercial reasons and because of the political pressure they're facing, that they're going to need to find ways to underwrite journalism. I mean, Facebook spent probably $100 million a year last year on content deals with a range of news organizations, which, it's a lot more than zero. Like, it's not single-handedly going to turn the thing around, but it's it's a decent start. And I think they're currently at war with the Australian government over this, but I think they're facing pressure all over the world. And I don't know, it's possible that it'll totally collapse and they will end up pulling news off their platform. But I think more likely they'll probably reach a bunch of deals with news or industries in various countries that Google will then probably be forced to follow. So that's one relatively positive signal.
Well, another aspect to this is we're still sort of talking in terms of print, of print on screens and print on paper, really, aren't we? I mean, and increasingly I found that people, they don't want to read, they want to see a podcast.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, right. There's all right. That's a growing, audio is a rapidly growing space. Although the pandemic has put a damper on that a bit. People now have, people aren't commuting, and so they would rather watch Netflix if given the choice. Yeah, I think I think you're not seeing the kind of flourish. I mean, I think what you saw for the last, like 5 or 10 years ago, you saw these like dramatic collapses and also really interesting dramatic new investments. And I think now it's a much more incremental, careful attempt, often by companies that don't have venture capital behind them, that are trying to be a little, are trying to grow more carefully, basically. But obviously the biggest positive trend just in like running these businesses is that people are willing to pay for news, like, in a direct to consumer, do it on your, particularly just like, it's a thing people have been saying for years, and it's very kind of like boring and wonky, but, mobile payments are getting better and better. And that, and people are, purchasing news subscriptions on the internet, and that's, accelerating. And obviously at some point that will max out, but that's the one really sort of encouraging thing at the moment, I think. And you saw, here in the US, there's a sports blog called Deadspin that was forced to, that fell apart for complicated reasons, and 19 of the writers launched something new and really brought a large enough paying audience just to immediately be a going concern with 20 journalists, which is pretty cool.
That was, as you say, they brought their brand with them, as it were.
Yeah.
But you mentioned earlier about the Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, the others, and the two things that occurred to me about that is, I wonder, I should have checked, how many of their subscriptions are corporate business subscriptions and how many are personal. These are people for whom information is money, information is business. They're not reading because they've got an idle, dilettante sort of thoughts about, oh, I wonder what the weather is in Uzbekistan today. They're buying it because they're trying to see whether the gold or the oil in Uzbekistan is going to come their way or not. And their companies are prepared to pay for it.
Yeah, that's obviously part of their business. And Bloomberg, which we haven't mentioned, but is, one of the biggest and most successful news businesses in the world, that's really the bulk of their business. There's not, and there is an interesting new wave of trade publications too that I think are a little under the radar. The Business of Fashion is a very good new fashion industry publication. The Information is a very good tech industry publication. And obviously, as you say, they have the advantages that they can get people to take their corporate Amexes out.
It always helps, yes.
Yeah.
And they get the advertising for it as well, if they're from the right people who think that there's money in there, there's money in those pages.
They also often, there's a real big events business there that is obviously on hold.
Mm-hmm. Well, some of the publications I worked for, they made far more money out of hosting conferences and awards than they did out of their own publications, which were pretty much lost leaders. And I'm wondering to what extent that's going to be the case with the New York Times. I know wouldn't ask you to say anything, but the major legacy newspapers, how much it's their legacy that will be useful for monetizing in other means, rather than as a generation of income and revenue in their own right.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think it's one of these moments when people when I think people have gotten past looking for like a single silver bullet to save the business and are realizing that this has always been a tricky business where you try to cobble together a bunch of different revenue streams, but you don't expect it to be Facebook or Twitter and print money.
But speaking of where we started about the contents of it, we have really heavy pressure from the government on journalists at the moment. They are being vilified daily. We've seen, I don't want to get too alarmist about it, but when the police think with impunity they can go and arrest somebody with a press pass with a camera in full view of the world, then there's a change in attitudes here. In the old days, the NYPD would have been clever and hit him from behind. They wouldn't have come up in front and confronted him with the press pass.
Yeah. I think that, it's polarization. It's because you have, 40% of the country that increasingly sees the media as sort of a political adversary, which how Trump has framed it. And then you do have the converse, which is, 40% of the country that when you tell them you're a reporter, they say thank you for what you do, as though you were like a nurse.
I can't remember the last time that's happened to me, but still.
Yeah, it happens. And I think, which also I find kind of uncomfortable. And yeah, and I think actually, one of the challenges is there's a great business in that second 40%, right? In saying to people, yes, we're here on the barricades with you. But that has its own kind of distorting effects.
Yeah, well, that's one of the difficulties. It refers back to what we were saying before, is that the press, it's difficult. It seems to be that we have the successful press is a partisan press. It starts with an attitude.
For a long time in a lot of places, right? I mean, it has not historically been true here.
Yeah, but I mean, Fox's niche is because it appeals to a particular attitude and presents news in a particular way. CNN used to present news in a slightly more partisan manner, but moved to the middle of the road. But it's being pushed in popular perception by the president and others. I mean, you think it was Radio Moscow from the way he shouts at it.
Yeah, it's not sort of not clear whether this is a state-run TV or a TV-run state.
Maybe some creative amalgam. We have a question coming in. If you want to, how has the measurement of journalism changed the profession to date? How do you anticipate it will continue to change as measurement becomes more and more precise? I'm not quite sure I get that. Measurement.
I think certainly at BuzzFeed, you could get a lot of data on the traffic to your stories. And you were encouraged to think about, why people were reading something or not. I think ideally measurement can make your work a lot better. You can tell why people are reading it and what they're reading. I mean, in its dumbest and worst cases, it can be sort of focused on trying to pick up kind of, just pure traffic and, and as particularly as the rates of digital advertising have gone down, it's really pointless. Like you just can't ever pay for sort of hard journalism with traffic alone. But I think, I'm very pro measurement too much. And like, I always thought it would be cool to have, and we had the data, but this drove editors crazy and nobody wanted to do this. But, when you publish like a 10,000 word piece, often nobody reads to the end, right? And wouldn't it be cool to be able to see as people were scrolling that they were dropping off, where exactly they were dropping off, and then go in and fix that transition and keep them hooked, which I always thought would be great and really keep people going through the story. I think my features editor at the time, when I was suggesting that, felt like, they had put a lot of work into this article, and the idea that you would then publish it and immediately reopen the editing process made everybody hysterical. But I think, ultimately we're doing this stuff because we want people to read it, and not to put it in a drawer. And so I think it's pretty important that journalists, are aware of and understand kind of who's reading something and why. And the more you can know about that, the better, with the context that if your boss needs to not tell you that's the only important metric. But actually, I think good reporters have a pretty good grasp of the intangible metrics of, did this kind of hit? Did this have impact? Did this get somebody fired? And I think it's been very valuable. I mean, I never understood I feel like there were newspaper journalists who were doing work that nobody ever read, and they just didn't know that nobody ever read it. And then they were like alarmed to learn that, in fact, like the day story about the thing that happened yesterday on the campaign trail was not a thing anybody wanted. But I don't know, that doesn't seem like really the fault of the measurement.
Well, I must say my proudest moments in my career have been the people I've got fired, or the people whose jobs I've saved when other people were trying to fire them. So that sort of metric is there. But you get into the Black Mirror part, where there are some organizations that pay or demote or promote journalists depending on how many hits they get on a story, which has got to be really dangerous because it panders to that lowest common denominator we were talking about earlier on.
For sure. Although there have always been news organizations that, pander to the lowest common denominator and were entirely focused on, getting the most eyeballs to the story, right? I mean, we can measure better, but that kind of journalism isn't new at all. I see there's some more questions. Should I try to?
Have you got one?
Yeah, there's a Q&A window that just popped up for me. Should I answer from it or?
Yes, please.
All right. Well, the first.
Yes, I found it now.
Yeah, why don't you tell me which one? There's a bunch.
Well, it's asking you, how do you feel about the decision to publish the Russia dossier, especially with the Michael Cohen book coming out?
I haven't. I think I feel the same way I always felt. I mean, I think it was obviously of public interest. A federal court wound up deciding that. And we published it in a pretty clear context that we didn't know if it was verified, but it was already very influential. And I think you would have, within weeks or months, had we not published it, seen public officials, journalists, people like John McCain in particular, acting in ways toward Trump that would have been very hard to explain if you didn't know they'd all read this thing. You would have seen, Congressman Adam Schiff and Devin Nunes get into this nuclear fight over, and then I guess we would have said over a document that we've read, but that we don't want to show you because we're afraid it would burn out your eyes. I think it would have become very hard to understand the politics of 2017 without seeing it.
No, there's a lot of that about. The other one here is new BBC director Tim Davie said one of his top priorities is to renew the BBC's commitment to impartiality. And he also said he doesn't support any switch from the license fee. People should know that in Britain, people pay a license fee every year for the television, which pays for the BBC services, radio and TV. But the ITN services are self-financed, the independent are self-financed from advertising. What are your thoughts of the prospect of huge, influential, but economically struggling broadcasters like the BBC?
I guess the BBC, there's nothing really like the BBC. And it's hard to say they're economically struggling either because, their financial footing has a lot to do with ultimately government decisions in a totally unusual way. To me, one of the really interesting challenges right now is that, there's an effort by the social media platforms to label state media. And the Trump administration is trying to take over the kind of quasi-independent Voice of America and turn its politics to the right. In Poland, they've really fully taken over the state media and done that. And in countries with a tradition of independent state media, often it's being kind of reined in. But I think it's also...
This was the whole purpose of the license fee, of course, to guarantee...
independence.
Well, not guarantee, but at least to avert the possibility of government interference.
Right, which has never been wholly successful at.
No, it hasn't.
But I think there are these, different traditions of state media in different countries, but it's a little hard to explain on paper what makes the BBC so utterly different from RT. Or maybe it isn't hard to explain, but I think, as these social platforms try to sort of put in a different standard for state media, there's a whole spectrum, basically, maybe, with Russia Today at one end of being totally servile to the state and the BBC at the other end of being pretty independent or quite independent. And a whole spectrum in between, where Voice of America is maybe halfway in between those two or something, in that it is really intended as an instrument of American foreign policy, but also has independence. So, I think...
he also did this. He did the same number for the military press. You might remember. Recently, right. It was quite disturbing. He took over the Military Times, was it, and several others. And
I don't think I don't know the story, but in any case, I think it's sort of a complicated. I think it's complicated for an audience, for somebody on the internet who comes across these things to understand why they're so different. And I worry that it's a little hard to explain, even though we all know it.
Well, Frank Gomez wants to know about the generational differences in news consumption. Is the youth trend towards internet news a threat to traditional sources?
I think the traditional sources that have been most successful are the ones that have become internet news: the Times, the Washington Post, the BBC, for sure. I think there's basically a convergence between these things. I do think there are also, I actually think the biggest sort of, there are kind of you know, hyper-partisan outlets. I mean, Facebook is really kind of dominated by hyper-partisan right-wing, mostly outlets. And they're individuals increasingly who become the sources of news for people, kind of influencers and political figures going to, I mean, in some sense, Trump is basically running kind of a media company himself, delivering his supporters the news directly in kind of an unintermediated way. So I think that it's not so much that, you know, the traditional sources are in one place and the untraditional ones are in another, as that we're all fighting it out on kind of the terrifyingly level playing field of the internet.
I mean, having transited from one to the other, the idea that I could phone in a correction to the editor and see it appear in front of me instead of biting my nails to see whether it made it in time for the press in the morning.
No, I mean,
it was liberating.
But like in most ways, I mean, the internet is obviously better. You also don't have to cut down forests full of trees to get people their news. I mean, it's, you know, far superior, although some bumps.
Yes. Well, apparently we have to burn tons of carbon dioxide to feed the server farm, keep it in print, to keep it up there. Alan Dodds-Frank has been asking about the resignation of James Murdoch. Do you think this is going to have any effect? This is dynastic as much as media politics. Is the schism in the Murdoch dynasty going to have any effect on Fox and coverage in general that way?
That is the kind of question I'd expect from my cousin Alan. I think the Murdoch family dynasty is a great story, and I think there's some, you know, I think James Murdoch is sort of part of the reason he resigned from News Corp. I think he's positioning himself, among other things, as somebody who actually thinks about the business, not just about the ideology. And News Corp, among other things, like the stock has really underperformed comparable, like the New York Times stock has the business has obviously underperformed the Washington Post. And I think part of what he's trying to say is that not only are his brother and father, you know, destroying the climate and electing populists, but they're running the business into the ground. And I think he's trying to kind of lay the groundwork for an argument of why they should get tossed out at some point. I mean, some point presumably being after Rupert Murdoch dies, because I don't think anything's going to happen before then. And you see a lot of positioning in advance of that. The son, who's sort of Lachlan, who is technically the CEO of Fox, you know, has really been an unbelievably kind of weak figure, kind of absent as Fox has been in some sense kind of captured by the president. So it's a good business.
Well, I remember when they started, the Sun was the milk cow that paid for it all in Britain.
Yeah.
The tabloid. I mean, it was close to bankruptcy several times, and it was the Sun's revenues what done it, as they would say in a headline. But
yeah.
they've...
but now it's, you know, News Corp is this, you know, conglomerate of, you know, Dow Jones and the Journal, which are still good businesses. And, you know, if you think about, had the Journal, you know, transformed itself into a big global brand, you know, global contemporary brand with great technology, the way the Times did, could be much more successful, and still is doing fine. But then also a whole bunch of struggling Australian newspapers and things like that.
Well, the Journal is interesting because, as you know, if you ever speak to a Wall Street Journal reporter and they do some extremely good reporting, they're always very eager to distance themselves from the opinion page. And the question is this ideology. It happened with their father. Their father set up the Australian, and for a long time, on the grounds that you didn't defecate on your own doorstep, the Australian was allowed to run as a serious newspaper. And then I used to write for it. It was the only Murdoch paper I ever wrote for on a regular basis. And then some 20 years ago, they had the bright idea they would take it the same way and get its ideology in line with the rest. As far as I understand, its circulation plummeted and its profitability went with it.
Yeah, it's a sort of, I mean, it's a complicated picture. The Journal is doing a pretty good job. Yeah, I mean, they still lose tens of millions of dollars a year on the New York Post as a kind of a strange vanity project, but that wields a lot of influence. I mean, it's just, you know, it just seems like they're going to kind of keep doing the thing they've been doing.
Well, the question here almost addresses that one. There are fairly graphic stories about sex in every major media organization. Can we expect more of this? Well, the Post might be a case in point.
Yeah, probably. I mean, I would think so. People do seem to be interested in sex.
It's very much so, yes. And the more prurient, the better, as it's, but I'm politically incorrect. So let's see. We've got a reporter from Scotland asking, do you think there's a real danger that the public would distrust the media and journalists in general when certain politicians have tried their very best to demonize the free press and journalists?
Yeah, I mean, that's obviously totally happened. You know, I think although it's, again, there's no one public. I think it's polarized. I think you have one part of the U.S., and it's true, it's similar in the U.K. Well, the U.K. is different, but there's one group in the U.S. who, you know, have been taught to distrust everything, that been told to distrust everything from the kind of establishment media, you know, except the occasional story that they like. But then you also have a huge chunk of the public who, in sort of reaction to that, have really like very, very deeply embraced institutions like the Times and the Post and see them as the, you know, last guardians of democracy, and the institutions in varying degrees are, you know, embracing that back and turning it into a business, among other things.
Yeah, well, you hinted earlier that there was really no golden age of journalism. It was the age on which, you know, you send the telegram, I'll send the war to Havana.
Yeah.
And,
yeah, there's a lot of
this is not new.
Yeah, no, there's a lot of false nostalgia for sure.
It's a Lord Rothermere praising the black shirts as the coming people who everyone should support. The memory hole is real. It's not just an invention of Orwell. They put this stuff down there, and in this case, we have we're looking increasingly at an ability to forget what happened a few weeks before. That this is the bit. I did an essay some years ago that, you know, Orwell was an optimist that people would try to remember, and this news would have to be destroyed. But, you know, nobody remembers how the Iraq war started. The paper that actually provided the false evidence, that helped provide the false evidence to it, is sort of denouncing it now as though it was obvious all along. It's the ability of people to disappear up their own rectums, as it were, to protect their own self-image is fairly incredible.
Yes, absolutely. No, and I think there's also a story in not untold, but, you know, the extent to which the same companies that Trump is now made the sort of center of his politics to denounce. So these are the companies he worked for, NBC in particular, and The Apprentice. I mean, he's a creature of these big media companies. That's why he knows them so well.
Oh, your cousin has just chipped in from Alan. Did you see the Wall Street Journal editorial flaying Trump and then endorsing him? It was unbelievable. But believing two impossible things before Brexit is what we've always done. The
Murdoch-Trump relationship is, you know, Murdoch is said to have told people privately that he's an idiot, but also obviously enjoys access to power and always has, and makes the most of it. And if you look at the sort of regulatory decisions of Trump's agents, of the Trump kind of communications agencies, they're actually kind of incoherent, and sometimes they're more progressive and sometimes more conservative, but the one common thread is that they typically reach the result that favors News Corp's commercial interests.
Which is what happened in Britain as well with Tony Blair. There was a whole array of decisions, political decisions made because you got the support of the Murdoch empire if you did.
Yeah, and ultimately it's in some sense a small political price to pay for that support, which is pretty formidable to, you know, block the acquisition of a rival chain of television stations by another rival chain of television stations, which they did last year.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, this is easy for people like Murdoch because it's other people's money he's playing with. It's a small expenditure from him, but it's lots of other people's money and reputations to get involved. With tech billionaires saving brands like the Washington Post and Time magazine, is the opposite the model of the Texas Tribune and NPR, a mix of consumers, grants, and underwriting? So that's a bigger question, really, of how can we get a viable financial model?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And I think like for a lot of the, if you look at like, what are new institutions that are hiring journalists and are doing interesting work, the nonprofits, and the Texas Tribune was kind of the first of them and the model, I think, but a bunch of kind of local and state ones doing, really unglamorous accountability journalism have sprung up. And I think I actually think it's a really good model, because the thing about, in New York, the old Daily News, New York Post used to do really aggressive city hall coverage, but ultimately the thing that sold their newspapers was sports. And they did, and crime and lurid sex stories and everything else. And as all that stuff kind of unbundled, you were left with this kind of rump of political and policy and accountability journalism that never had a big audience. I mean, at one point in my career, I ran like the most popular blog in New York City politics. And if I got like 1,000 or 2,000 readers a day, that was like a really good day. This was a while ago, but it's stuff that really matters, that where, the difference between a reporter showing up at that meeting and a reporter not showing up at that meeting has a huge impact on the outcome. It doesn't necessarily mean that there are 1 million people who want to read the story about the incremental development at the city council meeting. And I think for that specific end, that it's a really good model. There's a new organization that just launched in West Virginia doing this. In New York, there's a nonprofit called The City that is doing this really well. And I really think it is, and it's something where I think philanthropists and kind of, city father types, civic leaders who really didn't used to see journalism as an outlet for philanthropy are starting to say, oh, okay, this is like a public utility. It's like the water. It's like electricity. It's something you need for a functioning, thriving city, and it's worth subsidizing. So I don't know, actually, I find that really encouraging. And there's a lot of really kind of exciting new institutions, and the gaps they're filling are crazy. A reporter was telling me she was at like a Brooklyn courthouse covering a story the other day, and the court clerk said, "Excuse me, who are you?" And she said, "Oh, I'm a journalist." And the clerk said, "Oh, we've never had a journalist in here before, but I don't think you're allowed to be here." And she was like, "No, I'm pretty sure I'm allowed to be here. Like it's the First Amendment, whichever, it's the press has access to the courtrooms in this country." And the clerk had to go ask the judge because they had never seen a reporter before in Brooklyn.
Yeah, that's worrisome, and it means, of course, it does have societal implications. Yeah. Things can happen in a courtroom when the judges and the prosecutors know that there's nobody watching. It's really what the whole Black Lives issue is about. The police for years have been able to pretend that that they've been successfully able to stop people from watching.
Yeah, often with the complicity of these same local reporters who we are celebrating. So
yes, indeed. Well, this is one of the problems when you mentioned it before about beat reporting. On the one hand, if you're reporting something like the White House or City Hall or the police beat, then you get to know it. But on the other hand, you rely upon sources which are going to influence what they give to you. And if you put the wrong story in, you'll never get another leak again, ever.
Yep, no, they say, access is a curse, right?
Yes. No, well, it's a curse. But if you're a lazy reporter who just wants a paycheck, then having a story put on your desk by the local DA it's manna from heaven.
Yep.
And of course, that's what's happening on a political level now. I mean, the amount of leaks straight from one side to the other, masquerading as investigative reporting. Frank Gomez is obviously living in hope. Can you foresee the emergence of a liberal or left-leaning, politically driven media outlet like Fox? I mean, he means opposite of Fox, counter Fox.
I think that a lot of Democrats really love CNN, MSNBC, and the New York Times, but I wouldn't say that they are the mirror image of Fox. Like, I don't think it's a kind of symmetrical situation. I think you're seeing I would say like on the internet, The Intercept has emerged in some ways as kind of the Breitbart of the left. And I mean that in a positive sense, like they're attacking the Democratic Party from the left, but with, real journalism and reporting and kind of pushing in a way that feels, within the bounds of traditional journalism to me. But no, I don't think that you see tons and tons of liberals who are like deeply alienated from Fox, CNN, and the New York Times and want a more left-wing alternative, or at least I don't think there's been I mean, I think, the interesting thing is that, the MSNBC primetime really is the most sort of like, is the, prayer hour for some of the kind of left, but it sits inside this giant corporation that is kind of basically uncomfortable with it, even though it drives massive, massive ratings, and Rachel Maddow is this very, very important figure. So I think that's kind of an interesting, like, kind of quirk of the current system.
Remember Al Gore's ill-fated channel? I appeared on that, and I appeared on Fox all about the same time. I used to be a regular on Bill O'Reilly's show, which I enjoyed because he hit it off. The controversy was the thing. He stacked the odds. He made sure there were 4 people against me, but he liked the controversy. He liked the punch-up. He realized it was good for ratings and good for maintaining interest. But I found the MSNBC, they were, oddly enough, far more exclusive. They didn't want to hear anything that they might disagree with.
Yeah, I think it's, I think MSNBC is a little schizophrenic in trying to figure out what it is, and Fox has increasingly sort of fallen in line with the Trump movement, I would say.
Well, increasingly it'd be difficult. Well, as I say, they soon, after I'd appeared once, they had an inquest in the office apparently to just who left this lunatic on Bill O'Reilly's thing.
That's how I feel right now, Ian.
You do? Oh, well. Sorry about that. He was, and apparently he said, hey, it was good television. So, yeah. He got it at least. There's been an alarming increase in fake websites pretending to be established organizations. What do you suggest can be done to counter these fraudulent sites? I mean, without getting draconian censorship in.
I mean, I think, they live and die by the distribution they get on Google and Facebook in particular. And there's obviously already a lot of pressure on Facebook to find, to essentially push out the really egregious fakery and favor substantial news. I think, what it flies against is individuals on Facebook who want to share garbage that suits their biases. And, and whether they're being fooled or sort of fooling themselves, I think is sometimes a bit of an open question. But I think that's a big, that's kind of the challenge.
Susan Roth wants to know, since Republicans represent only less than 1/3 of registered voters, and conservative independents even a smaller proportion, why does Fox have such a big audience? They must have moderates and some liberals watching as well. Do you have any insight? I mean,
none of these places have a very big audience. But it's a country of 300 million people. A great night on television. It's not the 50s. Nobody's pulling 60 million viewers a night. I think a great night on cable TV. One of the debates is maybe 15 million, but I think if you turn on Fox during the day, you were one of a few 100,000 people who are watching, and a big night might be 6 or 7 million, which is a lot of people, but it is, a lot of, retirees basically. Like it's the I think the top demographic on cable, I can't remember the way Nielsen slices it, but the top is like ends at 75, and Fox has this problem that a lot of its viewers are above it and older, it's too old to exactly fit in the ratings. And they're always trying to bring their average the average viewer under 60. But I think it's actually not that, it's not numerically a whole lot of people, and it is mostly older people sort of watching television.
Well, but this gets to the core of our problem, the sort of self-regressive echo chamber. Why is the media so obsessed with the views, and why does it amplify the views of a small coterie of Social Security recipients?
I think that's really an interesting question, and I do not have a good answer.
No, I mean, it is. We help shape that perception as the media. So if we say the media are saying, and we know that it represents a tiny minority, a fairly small minority of uninfluential, economically inactive people, shouldn't we say so more often?
Probably. I try.
Okay, I think, are there any more questions here? Please, this is your last chance to get Ben before he runs away from the madman. We're good to wrap. Okay, thank you very much, Ben. Really appreciate the discussion. It's been fun, it's been lively. There'll be an inquisition afterwards. And we will hope to see you again soon. This is Ian Williams, President of the Foreign Press Association. We have more webinars coming up. We'll be speaking to Sonia Shah about emigration, which should be a hot button issue next week. And we'll hope to see you again sometime soon, Ben. I think it's been...
Yes, absolutely.
Thanks a lot.